Israel and the Palestinian people, to what extent do you think the struggle for a two-state solution, for example, a viable, independent Palestinian state, is now impossible? That instead there should be a struggle for a single state with equal rights for Jews and the Palestinian people? Or do you think, I mean, what prospects for Palestinian liberation and an independent Palestinian state, if
And,
not under the Democrats?
well, first we should be clear about what the alternatives are. Almost the entire discussion of this issue on all sides is exactly the way you presented it. One option is two states. The other option is one state with some kind of civil rights struggle. Two problems with that. The second option is not an option. Israel is never going to accept a state in which Jews are a minority or will soon be a minority. They'll never accept that. Second problem is that there's a third option, the one that is actually being pursued moment by moment. Read this morning's edition of Haaretz. There's a detailed discussion of the latest proposals of the highway administration. That sounds innocuous until you start looking at it. The new proposals, they've been developing a huge infrastructure program in the West Bank, sort of integrating it into Israel. Now they're moving forward with formal proposals to integrate the planning of the West Bank highway system into the Israeli and Golan Heights system. Single plan designed to ensure that if you're living in a subsidized villa deep in the West Bank and you want to get to work in Tel Aviv without having a traffic jam, you can go on a superhighway where you won't see any Palestinians and you'll be there in a short time. Let's meld it together in a single country. That is not a one-state solution. That's a greater Israel solution. It's been going on before our eyes for 50 years, step after step. Another big step announced this morning. The idea is to take the areas of the West Bank that are of value to Israel, but leave out the areas of Palestinian population concentration. So this new highway, this expanded highway system, goes near Nablus, but not into Nablus. Israel doesn't want to incorporate Nablus, big Palestinian population, into the greater Israel they're constructing. They want to make sure that the so-called demographic problem doesn't arise. Demographic problem means too many non-Jews in a state which is, according to the Supreme Court, the sovereign state of the Jewish people. That's before the nationality law. It's the sovereign state of the Jewish people, not the Palestinians. So let's build that step by step, integrate it together. We take what we want, greatly expanded Jerusalem, towns to the east of Jerusalem, Ma'ale Adumim, developed mostly during the Clinton years. Bring that in. There's a connection between them called E1, which the US and European pressure has blocked Israel from developing it. Read the Haaretz article this morning. They're showing how Israel's building roads right around it to have the same effect as the connection, but without incurring the opposition of the international community, which can pretend it doesn't see it, which is the way they've been acting all along. So let's take what we want piece by piece. Same with this connection, once it's established fully, essentially bisects the habitable part of the West Bank. Another one further to the north in Kadumim, Ariel, just what's left for the Palestinians will be the major population concentrations like Nablus, but then lots of villages scattered around, maybe by now probably close to a couple hundred of them, small enclaves surrounded by checkpoints, so that if a Palestinian farmer wants to get it to his olive groves, assuming they haven't just been burned down by settlers, he has to go through an Israeli checkpoint where the soldiers may or may not decide to let him go through. Okay. In other words, make life unlivable for the Palestinians. Take what you want. Jerusalem's about 5 times as large as it ever was, bringing in Arab villages. The so-called seam between the annexation wall and Israel, it's already integrated. Jordan Valley, population's been mostly kicked out on one or another pretext. Take that, that's about a third of the arable land in the West Bank. Pretty soon you have everything you want, all integrated. Very few Palestinians. That's what's been developing before our eyes. That is the alternative to a two-state settlement, not one state. That's not an alternative. Now the question is, of these two alternatives, is there an opportunity for a two-state development, some form of two-state system to develop? I think so. I don't think that game is over. Depends very much on U.S. policy. And if you take a close look at the United States, you can see a basis for U.S. policy changing. And if U.S. policy changed at all, Israel has to go along. The reason is, in the 1970s, Israel made a fateful decision. It was under the labor governments at the time, made a fateful decision to choose expansion over security. Very explicit choices. 1970s, there were clear options for a two-state settlement on the internationally recognized border, slightly, modifications. It was a ceasefire line, so straighten it out and so on. Minor and mutual modifications was the term used. Two-state settlement with guarantees for the right of each state to exist in peace and security within secure and recognized borders. I'm quoting from the wording of a 1976 Security Council resolution supported by the major Arab states, Jordan, Syria, Egypt, bitterly opposed by Israel. Prime Minister Rabin harshly condemned it, said we're never going to tolerate anything like that, vetoed by the United States. One of a series of such opportunities where Israel did make the clear decision that expansion was more significant to them than security, integration into the region, peaceful relations. Well, the effect of that is, one effect, which was obvious at the time, is it's going to drive Israel very far to the right, which of course happened. And the other consequence is it drives Israel into the US pocket. Israel now relies on the United States for survival. That's the choice that was made. You can see it developing in many ways. That means a lot depends on whether US policy changes. Can it? Just take a look at attitudes in the United States. Very important. Up until about 15 or 20 years ago, Israel's base of support was the liberal community. It's my own personal experience. If I wanted to give talks on Israel Palestine at a university, I had to have police protection because of the violent reaction. It's all changed. And now liberal opinion has sharply shifted. In many ways, more supportive of Palestinian rights. Support for Israel shifted to the far right, just as Israel itself has. So the base for support for Israel is evangelical Christians, hyper-nationalists, elements connected to the military and security industries. That's the base of support. That could be the basis for a change in policy. It's slow. Take a look at other movements in the past. It's slow, but it could happen. And if there's even, like, for example, on things like I just mentioned, the arguable illegality of all US military and economic aid to Israel. And that's something that a lot of people in the United States could resonate to if they knew about it.
Mhm.
All of these things could develop. If there's even a hint that they're developing, Israeli policy will change. They're far too dependent on the United States. In fact, if you look over the past record, every US president since Ronald Reagan, even earlier, since Reagan, every US president has made demands on Israel which they strongly opposed but immediately had to accept. The first exception to this is Barack Obama. No demands. He asked for nothing, just give them what they want.
Mhm.
He's considered hostile to Israel, but that's because Israel shifted so far to the right that unless you're voting for Netanyahu, you're a leftist, you know. But Obama was the first American president to make no demands on Israel. But if there are demands, they have to obey, just as they did in every other case. It's now more extreme. Well, could this lead to a change? I think it could. What about the settlers? You have two choices. One choice is to leave their subsidized homes, subsidized villas in the West Bank, get into the lorries that will be provided to them, and go to a subsidized home within Israel. The other option is stay there and become citizens of a Palestinian state. These are not impossible.
Mhm.
Greater things have happened. I think something on that line is still within the range of possibility. And the only likely alternative to it is just further imposition of the Greater Israel Project, which has been developing for 50 years. And as I said, it's an important announcement this morning of how it's going forward.